Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. In November 1961, Elizabeth Zott, a 30-year-old single mother, wakes before dawn, feeling her life is over, yet prepares lunch for her highly intelligent 5-year-old daughter, Madeline. Elizabeth tucks small handwritten notes into the lunchbox. Fuel for learning. Play sports at recess, but do not automatically let the boys win. It is not your imagination. Most people are awful. Madeline, who has been reading since age 3, but pretends not to at school to fit in, secretly removes and saves these notes. After a quiet kiss and a whispered, "seize the day," Elizabeth drives off in her Plymouth to KCTV studios, where she stars in the wildly popular cooking show, Supper at 6. Elizabeth, a research chemist by training, possesses flawless skin and an unmistakable air of being extraordinary. Her television career began unexpectedly due to food theft. Madeline's exceptional homemade lunches, lasagna, zucchini, kiwi, fresh cookies, were being eaten by her classmate Amanda Pine, the daughter of a local TV producer, Walter Pine. Madeline offered her lunch willingly for Amanda's friendship. When Elizabeth noticed Madeline losing weight, her scientific mind deduced the cause upon seeing Amanda with tomato sauce stains. Elizabeth stormed into KCTV, confronting the nervous, unassuming Walter Pine about his daughter offering friendship under false pretenses. Initially mistaking the striking lab coat-clad Elizabeth for an actress auditioning for a nurse role, Walter was eventually cowed by her forceful personality and her lecture on nutrition's importance for cognitive development. As Elizabeth lamented the lack of time to teach the nation about food that matters, Walter, desperate for a new show and captivated by her presence, saw an opportunity. Supper at 6 debuted weeks later. Elizabeth became an unlikely star. Serious, unsmiling, and treating cooking as chemistry, she presented hearty, practical recipes, emphasizing nutrition and efficiency. Her signature closing line, "Children, set the table. Your mother needs a moment to herself," resonated deeply. The show became a national phenomenon, influencing meals across the country. However, a reporter dubbed her Luscious Lizzie, a nickname that stuck and caused Elizabeth deep shame, especially in front of Madeline, who understood it belittled her mother's true identity as a chemist. Elizabeth's current life, she knew, was inextricably linked to one man, Calvin Evans. 10 years earlier, in January 1952, Calvin Evans was a celebrated, Nobel-nominated chemist at Hastings Research Institute, working in a large, private lab. Brilliant but impatient and known for holding grudges, especially against Harvard for rejecting him years prior, Calvin's only other passion was rowing. He'd chosen Hastings primarily for the sunny Southern California weather after enduring Cambridge's rain while earning his PhD and rowing for the university team. Socially awkward and unlucky in love, despite his rowing physique, Calvin was tall, lanky, and often slouched, with messy hair and lips he chewed constantly. His otherwise forgettable face was redeemed by a brilliant smile. Elizabeth, by contrast, had only received one job offer, Hastings, after her academic career at UCLA was abruptly cut short. Their first encounter at Hastings was confrontational. Elizabeth, needing beakers for her under-resourced lab downstairs, entered Calvin's restricted lab, ignoring warning signs and turning off his Frank Sinatra music. Annoyed, Calvin mistook her for a secretary and dismissed her. Incensed by his assumptions, Elizabeth grabbed a box of beakers using a requisition form and marched out. It took Calvin over a week to track her down in her crowded lab. She initially pretended not to remember him, but eventually acknowledged the minor beaker ownership issue. He apologized for his assumption and asked her out repeatedly, only to be rebuffed. Her lab tech warned her about Calvin's infamous grudges, fearing repercussions for their entire lab. Elizabeth, already dealing with systemic sexism at Hastings, held her own grudges against a patriarchal society that undervalued women. She overheard colleagues making crude remarks and mocking her seriousness, culminating in her boss, Dr. Donati, calling her a cunt. This triggered a traumatic memory from UCLA. Her advisor, Dr. Myers, a lecherous plagiarist, had sexually assaulted her in the lab after she pointed out an error in his research protocol. Defending herself, she stabbed him in the side with a number 2 pencil. Despite the clear self-defense, UCLA protected Myers, rescinded her PhD acceptance, and forced her out with only her master's degree. Now back at Hastings, facing similar hostility and professional sabotage from Donati, who reassigned her to a menial project, Elizabeth felt her resilience eroding. A few weeks after the Beaker incident, Elizabeth and Calvin encountered each other again at a performance of The Mikado. Calvin, on a miserable date and suffering from food poisoning, vomited on Elizabeth in the lobby. Recognizing him despite the mess, she helped him home, displaying unexpected kindness. They formally introduced themselves. "I'm Calvin Evans, Elizabeth Zott." The following week, they met for coffee. Elizabeth explained her research focus on DNA condensation agents, her interest in abiogenesis, the origin of life, and how Donati had sidelined her. Calvin, impressed by her intellect and hypotheses, revealed his own struggles with related research. He proposed a collaboration, suggesting that if he claimed to need her findings, Donati would have to reinstate her project. Elizabeth, wary but pragmatic, agreed strictly on professional terms. "I'm not dating you. This is work, nothing more." He readily agreed, both secretly hoping the other didn't mean it. Their collaboration deepened into a close intellectual partnership fueled by mutual respect and undeniable attraction. One Friday evening in the parking lot, Elizabeth nervously brought up bombacol, a silkworm pheromone, hinting at her feelings. Calvin, misinterpreting her scientific analogy and still insecure, responded dismissively. "Worms, great." Hurt, Elizabeth prepared to leave. But Calvin, realizing his mistake and her true meaning, stopped her. He confessed he wasn't after her lab equipment, and she retorted she wasn't the problem. In that charged moment, she pulled him into a passionate kiss, sealing a bond that defied simple chemistry. Their relationship blossomed. They were soulmates, their intellectual and romantic connection deepening daily. They worked seamlessly together, their productivity soaring. They eventually moved in together. Elizabeth negotiating rent payment through cooking dinners 5 nights a week, framing it as a trade agreement based on the chemistry of cooking. However, she staunchly refused Calvin's repeated offers to join his well-funded lab, determined to be recognized for her own merit. One night, the topic of family finally arose. Calvin revealed his traumatic childhood, parents killed in a train crash when he was 5, adopted aunt dying in a car crash when he was 6, followed by years in a rough Catholic boys' home. Elizabeth shared her own difficult past, a con man father who faked miracles like spontaneous combustion using pistachios and preached damnation for profit, a greedy mother, and a beloved older brother, John, who hanged himself at 17 after their father condemned his homosexuality. Elizabeth confessed her father was now in prison and her mother had fled to Brazil. Their shared histories of loss and unconventional families forged an even deeper bond, though both hid lingering pains. Calvin never mentioned the revelation about his biological father being alive, but having rejected him, and Elizabeth didn't fully share the trauma of the UCLA assault. Their obvious happiness and combined brilliance provoked jealousy among colleagues in the Hastings cafeteria, particularly the insecure Miss Frask from personnel, who was dating the boorish geology tech Eddie. Calvin, frustrated by Elizabeth's insistence on navigating Hastings' sexist environment alone, proposed marriage, presenting a ring box during lunch. Elizabeth, terrified of losing her identity and having her work subsumed under his famous name, Mrs. Calvin Evans, refused. Their argument, witnessed by the cafeteria, centered on societal expectations versus personal identity. She countered his argument about tradition by asking if he'd change his name to Zott, which he dismissed due to his fame. The argument escalated until Calvin mentioned wanting a family. Elizabeth panicked, thinking he meant children, which they'd agreed against, but he clarified, "I was only thinking that we could get a dog." Relief flooded her. Soon after, a stray dog, mangy, gray, and intelligent-looking, followed Elizabeth home from the deli. Calvin saw them approach and prophetically thought, "Elizabeth Zott, you're going to change the world." They named the dog 630, commemorating the time he joined their family. 630, secretly a failed military bomb sniffer traumatized by loud noises, quickly learned words and became fiercely devoted to Elizabeth. Calvin insisted the dog come to Hastings for stimulation, overriding objections from Miss Frask. 630 adapted, learning the campus layout and sensing Elizabeth's past suffering, determined to protect her. Elizabeth, sensing his own past trauma, felt equally protective. For Elizabeth, cooking remained a scientific endeavor. She meticulously documented recipes like chemical equations. Calvin, inspired by fitness guru Jack LaLanne, whose German Shepherd mascot, Happy, intimidated 630, decided Elizabeth should learn to row. Despite her reluctance and secret inability to swim, Elizabeth agreed. Their initial attempts in a pair boat were disastrous, constantly flipping into the cold water. Frustrated but persistent, Elizabeth studied physics textbooks, applying principles of kinetic energy, drag, and buoyancy to rowing. Her technique improved dramatically, stunning Calvin and impressing the other rowers, including the foul-mouthed coxswain Sam and the team captain, Dr. Mason, an obstetrician. Calvin, having discovered Elizabeth couldn't swim, had secretly arranged for them to join the men's 8-person boat for safety, claiming Dr. Mason had sought her talent. Elizabeth excelled, becoming a valued member of the crew, rowing 2-seat. Meanwhile, Dr. Donati continued to undermine Elizabeth, telling her she was overreaching and not smart enough for abiogenesis research. His animosity stemmed from a humiliating rowing defeat by Calvin's Cambridge crew years ago and general misogyny. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, a wealthy anonymous donor, later revealed to be connected to Avery Parker, specifically requested funding for abiogenesis based on Elizabeth's old UCLA paper, forcing Donati to reinstate her project. However, Donati took credit for this reversal, letting Elizabeth believe he'd recognized her merit. Calvin, furious upon learning Donati had initially canceled her project, confronted him, threatening to leave Hastings. Donati, secretly wanting Calvin gone, but needing his funding pull, allowed Calvin to believe his intervention saved her project. Both men kept their actions secret from Elizabeth, reinforcing her belief she'd succeeded on her own. Calvin, plagued by a superstitious fear that his love doomed people, saw rowing as a new danger to Elizabeth, especially after discovering she couldn't swim during another capsize. One morning, with rowing canceled due to weather, Elizabeth went to work early. Calvin, wanting them to commute together for safety, decided to run the 5 miles to Hastings with 630. Remembering Elizabeth's insistence on the new leash law and wanting to protect the dog, and secretly, he clipped the leash to 630's collar. Near the police station, a poorly maintained patrol car backfired loudly. The noise terrified 630, who bolted one way, while Calvin, startled, bolted the other. The taut leash acted as a tripwire. Calvin slipped on spilled oil, hitting his head hard. As he lay stunned, the patrol car, its brakes failing, rolled over him. He died minutes later, whispering 630's name, the broken leash dangling from his wrist. 630, injured but alive, witnessed the entire tragedy before limping away to find Elizabeth. Elizabeth was devastated, numb with grief. She couldn't cry. The funeral was a blur, attended by colleagues, rowers, and some gloating figures. A reporter, mistaking her stunned silence and focus on 630 for blindness, tried to interview her. She sat alone in the front row, leaving abruptly when dirt hit the coffin, walking the 6 miles home with 630. Returning to work felt impossible. Colleagues offered platitudes but kept their distance. Seeking refuge in Calvin's lab, she found it sterilized, his notebooks gone, secured by Hastings management. Only a crate of personal effects remained, containing photos, records, and poignantly, the ring box he'd proposed with. As she held it, Miss Frask entered, enforcing rules about next of kin, while delivering cruel gossip about Elizabeth being Calvin's mistress, free milk. Elizabeth became violently ill, and Frask, noticing her condition, spitefully confirmed her suspicion. Elizabeth was pregnant. Hastings management, facing a funding crisis after Calvin's death and negative press, saw Elizabeth's pregnancy as a liability. Despite recognizing her brilliance and the potential of her abiogenesis research, funded secretly by the anonymous donor, they couldn't tolerate the scandal of an unwed mother. Donati and Frask formally fired her, citing breach of conduct and unwritten rules. Elizabeth argued logically against the double standard, but was ultimately dismissed, Donati cruelly revealing that Calvin had threatened Hastings management to secure her initial funding, shattering her belief she'd earned it herself. Consumed by grief and professional betrayal, Elizabeth transformed her kitchen into a fully functional chemistry lab over several months, 630 assisting her. She supported herself by discreetly consulting for her former Hastings colleagues, charging cash. She meticulously tracked her pregnancy through scientific analysis, but struggled emotionally, feeling inadequate and overwhelmed. She bought Dr. Spock's baby book, but found little solace. One day, her neighbor, Harriet Sloane, a practical, gray-haired woman trapped in an unhappy marriage with the boorish Mr. Sloane, found Elizabeth collapsed on the lab floor. Harriet, initially wary of the pretty Elizabeth, offered coffee, made chemically by Elizabeth, pragmatic support, and crucial advice. Take a moment for yourself, every day, then recommit. Their unlikely friendship began. Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter. During labor, overwhelmed and angry at Calvin, she told the nurse she felt mad, which was mistakenly recorded as the baby's name on the birth certificate. Horrified, Elizabeth decided to call her Madeline, keeping Mad Zott a secret. Madeline was a challenging infant, crying incessantly. Elizabeth, sleep-deprived and isolated, felt like a failure. Dr. Mason, the obstetrician rower, visited, offering encouragement and reminding her of her place in the rowing crew. Harriet became indispensable, providing childcare and companionship. Madeline grew into a precocious, observant child, extraordinarily tall and intellectually advanced, reading far beyond her years, but struggling socially. Elizabeth, worried about finances and Mad's development, altered Mad's birth certificate to enroll her in kindergarten early at Woody Elementary under the disapproving eye of Mrs. Mudford. Returning to Hastings seemed the only financial option. Donati, needing Elizabeth's research to appease the mysterious donor, who was asking pointed questions about Mr. Zott's progress, rehired her, but demoted her to lab tech, assigning her demeaning tasks and insisting she take a stenography course. Simultaneously, Donati published Elizabeth's earlier research under his own name, with Borowitz as a reluctant co-author in Science Journal. Elizabeth discovered the plagiarism and confronted Borowitz, then Donati. Furious, she quit on the spot. That evening, Walter Pine called, proposing she host the cooking show Supper at 6. Desperate, she accepted. Her debut was chaotic. Appalled by the chintzy set and condescending script Walter had written, she went off script, throwing set pieces into the audience, speaking directly and seriously about chemistry, and challenging viewers intellectually. Walter was horrified, certain she'd be canceled immediately. However, the station was flooded with calls, mostly asking for clarification on chemical terms like CH3COOH, vinegar. The show, despite or because of Elizabeth's unconventional approach, began to gain traction. She introduced segments like analyzing viewer mail and applying chemical principles to everyday cooking, treating her audience as intelligent peers. Her refusal to simplify science or adopt a perky persona resonated with housewives who felt undervalued. Madeline, meanwhile, struggled at school. Mrs. Mudford disliked her intelligence and nonconformity. A family tree assignment caused distress, as Madeline knew little about Calvin's family beyond the tragic deaths and the boys' home. Harriet advised filling it with hodgepodge. Madeline, seeking answers, befriended Reverend Wakely, the minister who, unknown to her, had been Calvin's pen pal and had officiated his funeral. Wakely, touched by that situation, called All Saints Boys' Home, eventually confirming Calvin had been there and uncovering the existence of the Calvin Evans Memorial Fund, mysteriously endowed for years before Calvin's death by the Parker Foundation via a Mr. Wilson in Boston. Madeline, sharp and logical, noted the date discrepancy. Wakely gave her Wilson's P.O. Box address. Elizabeth's show continued its controversial rise. She discussed chemical bonds using marriage analogies, debunked Popeye's spinach myth, recommended rowing for fitness, good for your soul, and openly declared her atheism, sparking outrage but also fervent support. 630 became a beloved co-host after finding his way to the studio. He even thwarted a bombing attempt by a disgruntled viewer, sniffing out dynamite in a handbag and discreetly removing it, though the security guard Seymour Brown received the public credit. Life magazine decided to do a cover story. Despite Walter's warnings, Elizabeth agreed but insisted on focusing on science. The reporter, Franklin Roth, found her brilliant but guarded. At her home lab, she finally opened up, revealing the painful truths: the UCLA assault, her brother's suicide, her parents' abandonment, Donati's theft, her guilt over Calvin's death, and the depth of her love for him. Roth, deeply affected, wrote a piece celebrating her intelligence and resilience. However, his editor gutted it, replacing substance with sensationalism, focusing on the luscious Lizzie angle, and including damaging false quotes from Myers and Donati, plus Madeline's inappropriate family tree. The article was a distorted disaster, but made Elizabeth a national sensation, skyrocketing the show's ratings. Elizabeth, however, was devastated by the public misrepresentation and sank into a depression, baking brownies incessantly on the show. Madeline, heartbroken after reading the article and blaming herself for her mother's unhappiness, believing Frask's revelation that Elizabeth was fired because she was pregnant, gave Roth's unpublished, truthful article, Why Their Minds Matter, featuring Elizabeth alongside other overlooked women scientists, to Reverend Wakely. Wakely shared it with Elizabeth, who was moved but noted its rejection by science journals. Harriet, seeing Elizabeth's despair, submitted Roth's article to Vogue magazine. Elizabeth, buoyed slightly by Wakely's perspective, "You don't want out, you want back in," continued the show, but felt increasingly disconnected. One day, Harriet arrived with a black eye, courtesy of Mr. Sloan. Enraged, Elizabeth used that night's show to discuss poisonous mushrooms, thinly veiling advice on how to potentially dispatch abusive neighbors, which resonated darkly with her audience. Phil Lebensmall, her former boss, having seen the Vogue article featuring Roth's piece and Elizabeth's soaring popularity, unexpectedly called her into his office after hours. He berated her, threatened her, and then exposed himself, attempting sexual coercion. Elizabeth, unfazed, calmly pulled a large chef's knife from her bag, causing Lebensmall to faint dead away from shock, which triggered a non-fatal heart attack. Walter Pine became acting executive producer. Elizabeth decided to leave supper at 6 to pursue research again. She made the announcement on her final show, celebrating viewer Marjorie Phyllis's decision to pursue medical school and urging her audience to recommit to their own potential using Harriet's advice. Her closing words, "Class dismissed." Despite her fame, no research institutions offered her a position. The scientific community still dismissed the TV cook. Years later, Frask, now surprisingly head of personnel at Hastings, having leveraged her knowledge of Donati's misdeeds, called Elizabeth. The anonymous donor, Avery Parker, and her lawyer, Mr. Wilson, were back and wanted to meet her in Calvin's old lab. Elizabeth, suspicious, confronted them. She recognized Wilson's cufflinks from Calvin's diary description of the man who visited the boys' home. She pieced together the story of the Parker Foundation's funding of All Saints. Avery Parker then revealed the truth. She was Calvin's biological mother. She'd been forced to give him up at birth, told he was stillborn, only later learning he was alive, but then told by the lying bishop at All Saints that he had died young. She'd funded the memorial endowment focused on science and rowing in his honor. She only discovered he was truly alive upon seeing his Chemistry Today cover. after which she tried contacting him, the sad mother letters. But he never responded. She followed Elizabeth's career from afar. Madeline's letter to Wilson finally allowed Avery to confirm the full story through a private investigator. Avery showed Elizabeth a photo of Calvin's biological father, his spitting image. Finally understanding Calvin's deep-seated pain and Avery's long suffering, Elizabeth embraced her as family. Avery expressed her deep desire to know her granddaughter, Madeline. The meeting ended with plans for a family dinner. Elizabeth, holding Calvin's research boxes, retrieved years ago with Frask's help, returned to the lab with 6:30, ready to restart her work on abiogenesis, finally reclaiming her identity as a chemist. If you enjoyed this book breakdown, please consider liking this video and subscribing to get notified when we post our next book.